DLC has been on Nintendo's back burner for a long time. Sure, Splatoon 3 served up a tasty side order last year, and before that there was Fire Emblem Engage's extra modes, but the days have long since passed where we could expect most major releases to have downloadable content. However, with a new system in the offing, there is the potential for DLC to rear its head again in the form of a deluxe re-release for the Switch 2, which could double up as DLC for the legacy version. In this video, I'm going to look at 20 Switch games which might get a late-in-life glow-up in the form of a Switch 2 Deluxe Edition and hopefully Switch 1 DLC to boot. After all, late-in-life DLC is not unheard of for Nintendo. They did DLC for Captain Toad Treasure Tracker and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, both ports to start with, and in Mario Kart 8's case, they started nearly 9 years after the original game released for Wii U in 2014. DLC can also be very useful to them, as seen in the expansion pack to NSO, where they used it as a way to draw people to the online service. This is particularly useful for the company if they can keep people engaged with their content over that tricky period between the consoles as the Switch transitions to the Switch 2. So, without further ado, let's explore 20 games which could have late-in-life DLC. Number 1. Kirby and the Forgotten Land. This is a game that sold incredibly well, with 7.52 million copies on last report. It is the best-selling game in the history of the Kirby franchise, which is pretty impressive given how long in the tooth Kirby is. But almost all the Kirby content comes from one studio only, in the form of HAL Laboratory. In the past, they have had other teams such as Goodfeel and Vanpool helping out, but the former have been developing their own game Buckaroo alongside working on Princess Peach Showtime, while the latter are sadly now defunct. But regular Kirby entries are doubtless critical for HAL's bottom line. Again, I think we will see a major new 3D Kirby, but those kinds of games intrinsically take a long time to make. Forgotten Land itself released 4 years after Kirby Star Allies. In this case, resurrecting Forgotten Land with some extra content makes a lot of sense, and HAL has a particular history of this with games like Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe updating past content. If the Switch 2 goes for 8 or 9 years, it seems impossible to imagine that Forgotten Land won't be back for a victory lap of some sort, even if it's not in the first few years. Whether they will offer DLC to people who already own the game might remain in question, but with 8 million legacy players, if by this point the Switch 1 still isn't completely in the ground, it might feel like a smart thing to do. Number 2. Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is a tricky one because of course Zelda already had DLC in the form of the expansion pass. It's also difficult to imagine the Zelda team wanting to spend much time second-guessing themselves and George Lucasing past titles. This hasn't been their habit for most of their previous remakes. However, even if a new Breath of the Wild represents a graphical update over its predecessor, offering DLC for this makeover might be a good way to ameliorate the millions of players of Breath of the Wild who wouldn't double dip, but would feel frustrated at missing out on a slightly better looking version of the game. We know that Nintendo has demoed the hardware using Breath of the Wild, so this one seems like only a matter of time, although again, whether the upgrade will come as DLC seems questionable. And of course, there's another game in the same boat. Number 3, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. This game is more conspicuously underserved, as the lack of a master mode in particular feels like a way to leave something on the table for a new version to come, and Tears of the Kingdom is still recent enough that Nintendo could have been developing something new for it, especially if there's going to be a long wait for the next original Zelda, which, judging by the ever-increasing dev cycles of the games over the recent decades, does seem plausible. Also, Tears of the Kingdom was the weaker performing of the Wild duology, so it would make some sense to try to remount it for the new system, since theoretically, if more people have played Breath of the Wild, they might be more likely to try out the sequel than double dip on the same game a second time. Ultimately though, the pattern with Zelda games of a re-release after around a decade seems pretty hardwired, so my guess is that Tears of the Kingdom's fate is probably to return in the early 2030s, during which time the Switch 2 may still be on the market, but it's unlikely that Nintendo will be too interested in supporting the legacy Switch. But If they wanted a Switch 2 version on the shelves sooner, and given their investment, you might think, why wouldn't they? Then a quick drop of a DLC alongside a deluxe version could make sense as an anniversary treat for Zelda's 40th in 2026. Number 4. Ring Fit Adventure. Here is the odd thing about Ring Fit Adventure. Despite its absolutely huge success for the console because of its unique Pilates ring mechanics, it's difficult to imagine a direct sequel. Would you supply another Pilates ring or go with a different fitness mechanic? However, doing a new version of the game with even more splendid visuals and adding on a lot of additional content would make sense. You could still sell the extra content as DLC for existing owners, but the broad casual appeal of Ring Fit means that it would likely keep finding new players into the future if they had it on the new console as well. And if they do have a new fitness game which uses quite different mechanics and physical devices, the Pilates Ring title may not be considered direct competition in the same way most previous games are. I think there's a lot of leeway in Ring Fit Adventure, and I thought it very curious that they incorporated Ring Fit alarms into Alarmo, so I think there is a decent chance we may see more of it, though whether DLC is the best format for this, I am not yet sure. I could certainly see a deluxe version happening though. Number 5. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Surely the granddaddy of them all, Smash Ultimate was such a paragon of the format that short of tearing it all down and starting again with an ultimately less ambitious version of the franchise, surely the only way forward is to try to take the same shell of a game and innovate around it. Whether this would involve Switch 1 DLC, I am less. One would expect Sakurai to try to push the console as far and as fast as it could go, and this is one title where I think double dipping might feel justified if Sakurai does indeed cram it with the density of extra content that is his usual approach. Therefore, while I do expect to see more Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I'm not sure it's going to be something that Switch 1 owners will be able to partake in. Number 6. Pikmin 4. Arlo recently put out a video noting the presence of some frosty Ochi artwork, which was a little odd as Pikmin 4 never had an ice level, and while this was probably just a coincidence, there's no doubt that Pikmin 4 has been a huge success for the company in Japan, and they've pushed it massively and continue to do so. Would it make sense, therefore, to have it on their new console early on? Well, probably yes, if that means that more people might pick it up. And would DLC sell well? Quite possibly, especially given that Pikmin 3 had DLC and the modular nature of their Dandori challenges in particular mean that the game is especially suited to expansions of this kind. Of course, the argument against DLC is always that the time could be sunk into an original entry in the same series, and I have forecast before a Pikmin 5 game around 2027 or 2028, but Nintendo isn't averse to sales of its existing titles, and we know Pikmin is often particularly affected by long delays, with pretty much decade-long gaps between recent Pikmin mainline entries. Nor would DLC be too taxing on their development staff, since it's likely that, as with Pikmin 3 Deluxe, the hard yards will be put in by co-developer Eighting, possibly while the core team at EPD10 continued to create an innovative core mechanic for Pikmin 5 before starting production. But Pikmin 4 isn't the only such title that might benefit from a DLC upgrade. Number 7. Snipperclips. Largely forgotten now, but this was an iconic game of the early Switch and modelled the two-player modes really well. It seems to me like a really low-hanging fruit in terms of DLC, but while that would have got lost on the original Switch with so many games raining down from the sky, on the Switch 2 as a deluxe re-release for those who missed the original fun, it could be a great way for Nintendo to dust off a classic and maybe even employ mouse mode as part of the game. Number 8. ARMS. Okay, I know the great hope must be a full-on ARMS 2, but with ARMS being a relatively slight experience to start with, a deluxe version might be a lower-risk way to reach back into the world of Springman and Pals. Developers EPD9 are likely to have been working hard on the new Mario Kart and may have other original titles under their belt, but their passion for ARMS is undeniable, and so while this might not be the most obvious way to see the franchise return, it would allow fans to dust off their Switches and re-engage with the online scene, while new fans will be able to enter it in fresh and see what all the fuss was about. I do have a separate video exploring the potential for ARMS though, so I'm going to move on to number 9. Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. Another title curious for its lack of DLC, Three Hopes was a direct sequel to Three Houses and therefore might seem like an odd one to revive, since by the time the new version comes out, Three Houses could well be a few Fire Emblems old. However, with Three Houses being such a success for the Fire Emblem franchise, and with the capability of new players to be inspired to go and pick up the original game either on Switch or through eShop, there are good reasons for Nintendo to keep up the profile of the title, especially in fallow periods between Fire Emblems, fallow periods which seem to be getting longer in recent years as the development costs of making games for HD consoles rack up. Therefore, adding some DLC to Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes might not seem like such an obscure concept after all, and in particular it's possible that such content was planned but in the end scrapped due to the delay of Fire Emblem Engage, which meant that they couldn't ultimately release more Three Hopes content without trampling on the Fire Emblem Engage release. Number 10. Mario vs. Donkey Kong. Just like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, this is a small-scale, charming puzzler, and yet the series has a huge legacy. I'm not sure the original game did so incredibly well on first dip that it requires a full-on sequel at this stage, but Mario content can always be guaranteed a long tail of sales, and so shunting this to a Switch 2 version while giving existing players a bit of puzzly DLC might be an elegant way to revive the title for another few years. Speaking of double-dipping Mario though, Number 11. Mario Maker 2. In one sense, the Mario Maker series is iterative enough that there is no obvious reason to do a deluxe version of a previous game instead of a full Mario Maker 3. But then again, if they don't want to really push the concept far enough for a full sequel, and yet they still want to have a Maker experience on Switch 2, a deluxe version could make sense. That long mystery of the extra game modes plural alongside the 3D World version would make sense, as they could incorporate a Super Mario Wonder Maker, although quite how this would manage given the crazy Wonder Flower effects, I'm not quite sure. This feels like the way the 2D Mario team EPD10 could focus on the more profitable and more popular Super Mario Bros. 2D series going forward, but still tip their hat to Maker fans, and would essentially be an inversion of what they did at the start of the Switch's life, where New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe got the remaster treatment, and Super Mario Maker 2 was the game that they spent the most time developing. As for whether they'd allow DLC with existing players, I think there's a strong case for it, as with any online game, since they will want people re-engaging with the content, and having lots of existing levels is a good way to go. Number 12. Super Mario Party Jamboree. Usually, I would not expect a Mario Party game to get additional content. After all, the whole point of these is that they're made regular as clockwork, and so you don't have to wait long for another to appear. However, in this case, Jamboree arrived so late in the life of the original Switch and was so much more fully featured than its predecessors that it makes me wonder if they had grander designs for it than just to mark time before the Switch fell off the perch. A Switch 2 version would doubtless continue to sell, and if the next original Mario Party isn't until 2027, which would be Nintendo Cube's regular 3-yearly pattern with the series, then Nintendo is unlikely to want to sit on its hands and not offer a substantial Mario Party experience for the new console if they can help it. Offering DLC for Switch 1 owners will be a simple way to soothe the pain of not having the latest version, while I'm sure a Switch 2 version will continue to sell decently well, justifying its publication, even if the additional features were quite meagre. Also note that we're going into a big time for Mario, with the 40th anniversary of the Super Mario Bros. Series and the Super Mario Bros. Movie sequel in quick succession, so having one of the premier Mario franchises on the Switch 2 could be seen as a priority. Number 13. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. Okay, they added DLC to the last port they did to Switch. Could they do the same again? There is, after all, something left on the table, specifically the 3D World exclusive levels, which were traded in for Odyssey levels in the Switch port. With 3D World now released, and with the potential of another set of DLC levels that tie into the next Mario game, I could see the 3D Mario team continuing Captain Toad as a bit of an indulgence. Not a full new game, but another burst of DLC that would accompany a new Switch 2 Deluxe Edition. The advantage of the Switch 2 version version as well is that because it would incorporate 2 sets of DLC, the content of the game would be far more significant, and so they might even be able to put it out at a higher price point, which, from Nintendo's point of view, would surely be for the good. Number 14, Super Mario Odyssey. I would not expect anything major to be added to Odyssey in the short term, given that there will be a new 3D Mario almost certainly in the near future. However, there are 2 ways that this could come about. Either for the anniversary, they could do a graphical glow-up and send it out possibly as an option for Switch 1 owners to do an upgrade, or they could save it for the mid-gen and have it as a 3D World style mid-life remake. Obviously, Super Mario Odyssey sold much more than 3D World, so in this sense, it might represent a less promising option for Nintendo to revive, but Odyssey's mechanics are so distinctive and offer so much potential that I could see them wanting to return to it. As with any late-in-life deluxe version, the question remains as to whether this will be offered as DLC or whether people would be expected to buy the new game, and in this case, I suspect they would not treat it as just an extra mode or two, but would go all out and ask a decent price for it, probably excluding Switch 1 owners from the concept. Number 15, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. Okay, this seems like a bizarre one, but hear me out. The Thousand Year Door is clearly popular with a particular fan base, though perhaps the sales don't reflect that broad popularity. If Nintendo wanted to test the waters with a sequel to the title, they would be far better off doing a smaller expansion to this game than they would be doing a whole new Paper Mario themed around the Thousand Year Door. I don't think this is likely at all, but the chance to have a Thousand Year Door sell as new to audiences on Switch 2, while also exciting fans of the original, who would doubtless keep hyping the game to Kingdom Come, they might see that that is worth it. It also might be an opportunity to fix some of the performance issues that seem to have kept a minority of Thousand Year Door fans from picking up the remake version. Number 16, Astral Chain. Sure, we've been expecting or hoping for a sequel to this impressive 2019 Platinum title, but what if Platinum and Nintendo have other ideas? What if, for whatever reason, a new title hasn't quite come together? The chance to do a DLC version appended to a new version of the original, or even just a flat-out graphical update of the already impressive original to raise the franchise's profile, could be excellent options for Nintendo. Bayonetta 3 ended up being nearly a decade in development, and they started the hype cycle in earnest by bringing Bayonetta 1 and 2 to Switch in 2018, so repeating the process by bringing back Astral Chain would make some level of sense. Of course, if the benefits are only graphical, there may not be much for Switch owners to download, but it would make sense to offer existing owners who may also have a Switch 2 to have a reason to return to the game. Number 17, Bayonetta 3. With Hideki Kamiya leaving Platinum Games, Bayonetta is left in an odd position, and perhaps one way to keep the franchise alive would be to bring Bayonetta 3 to the new system, either just with new graphics or even with a new gameplay element as a kind of proof of concept that Kamiya-less Platinum Games can still meet fan expectations. I think it would benefit Platinum to have their major Nintendo title of recent years on the Switch 2 so that it can continue to sell a little more easily, but whether they want this at this stage to go treading into Bayonetta in a major way, I'm less sure. Of course, this could be a way they test the water for more Bayonetta later in the Switch 2's life, another case of using a re-release to whet people's appetites. In this case, though, I would expect Nintendo not to repeat these Switch 1 mistakes and have the re-release much closer to the new title. Number 18, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. What, new funky mode wasn't enough for you? Look, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe shows that even if a port has had a relatively modest set of extra content for the new edition, there is potential for something more substantial later on down the track. I would only expect this if and when Nintendo decides to do something big with Donkey Kong. The risk is that if they have a new 2D title, Tropical Freeze would simply compete for attention, and that's something that they wouldn't want. However, if they decide to take the Great Ape into the third dimension, then things would look very different, and they may appreciate having a real 2D classic to bring into the modern era. Retro has expanded in recent years, so they surely could handle some DKC DLC, and the game is well regarded enough that its return would probably not get the cold shoulder. Number 19, new Pokemon Snap. Another long-awaited and much-hyped title yet to receive paid DLC. I could see the Pokemon Company wanting to do a full new version of this game and selling it as new, as is their usual pattern. But there is a precedent for them to re-release an older title, and that is Pokken Tournament DX, also made by Bandai Namco. Could Bandai Namco do the same with new Pokemon Snap? If the Pokemon Company don't have any immediate plans to return to the relatively low-selling photography spin-off, perhaps it makes sense to put it on the Switch 2 shelves for the long term with a bit of paid DLC alongside. And finally, number 20, Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Here's one concept that I do think has a chance. With no DLC for Wonder and plenty of potential for the concept, it seems like a great moment for them to release a new version of the game. The only caution I have is that it appears they're setting up Super Mario Bros. Wonder as an iconic example of a Switch 1 game, and they might not want to muddy the waters with a Switch 2 version of the same game. Okay, that's our 20, but I have to chuck in one more because, well, I just do. Number 21 then is Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp. Theoretically, this game would benefit from DLC because of its modular campaign-based nature and would be a great way for WayForward to refamiliarize themselves with the franchise after moving away from it in recent years. Re-releasing Advance Wars after its aborted previous launch might be a great way to milk more sales from a franchise which must have disappointed them. In this case, I can't see that they would offer DLC to existing Switch fans, as I can't imagine the install base is sufficiently great to justify it, but personally, I wouldn't mind for the chance of more Advance Wars, hugely unlikely, though I think such an opportunity would be. Hear the comments and tell me which Switch games you'd like to see get late in life DLC. Thanks for everyone for sharing, commenting, subscribing, liking, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.